I knew something was off the second I heard boots crunching on my gravel driveway at 7 in the morning. I looked out the window, coffee still in hand, and saw two guys in neon vests measuring the edge of my backyard like they owned the place. One of them had a clipboard, the other a tripod with a surveyor's scope aimed directly at my tool shed. I stepped out on the porch in my slippers, still in my pajama pants, and shouted, "Hey, you lost or just trespassing for fun?" The clipboard guy flinched like he wasn't expecting anyone home. "We're with Briar Glen HOA, he said, like that was supposed to mean something. "Just conducting a boundary survey on my land without permission," I asked, walking toward them. "You got papers, a warrant?" "Anything from the county?" "No, but then get off my property before I call the sheriff." They exchanged looks, but I didn't wait. I pulled out my phone and started recording, then walked right up to them. "Names, now, Dale," the tripod guy said. "Ron," said clipboard. "Cool. Dale and Ron, I hope you enjoy explaining to the sheriff why you're trespassing with HOA orders and no legal documentation." They packed up fast. I followed them down the driveway, made sure they didn't stop again. I live just outside the main loop of Briar Glen, on a bit of land that used to be farmland before the developers rolled in. I got my property line surveyed when I bought the place 4 years ago. It was clear then, and it's clear now. My house ain't part of the HOA, never been, never will be. But that hasn't stopped them from trying, and I knew exactly who was behind this. Gloria Vander, president of the HOA and queen of unsolicited opinions. Later that afternoon, she showed up like clockwork, powder, blue pantsuit, sunglasses, and a folder clutched like it held the Constitution. "Walter Venn," she said, stepping right onto my front porch without an invitation, "we need to talk." "I don't need to talk to anyone who sends goons onto my land at dawn," I said, not even glancing up from the birdhouse I was fixing. They weren't goons. They were licensed surveyors. "And this land," she waved her hand toward my backyard, "is under Briar Glen's purview. You may not realize it, but the latest plat map, I have the deed. I have the county records. I have the original plat. You got nothing," Gloria sniffed. "You'll be hearing from our legal committee." "Good. I'll be hearing from my lawyer too. And the sheriff. Try that stunt again, Gloria, and I'll press charges." That shut her up for a second, but she didn't back down. Of course she didn't. She just flipped open that folder and pulled out a copy of a poorly drawn map covered in highlighter and notes. "This," she said, "says otherwise. I'm not joking, Gloria. 1 more inch over that line and I'll show you what trespassing charges look like in real time." She left in a huff, her heels stabbing into my lawn like it offended her. I watched her leave, then walked straight back inside and pulled out my own folder copies of the county plat, the survey from when I bought the house, photos of the original boundary markers. If she wanted a fight, she was about to get it. And I was going to make sure everyone in Briar Glen saw exactly what kind of circus their HOA had become. By the next morning, I had already contacted the county registrar's office and confirmed what I already knew. Nothing had changed about my property line. But something else stood out on the call. The clerk mentioned a pending annexation petition filed by Briar Glen HOA, a document that included my parcel number. That was the first time I realized Gloria's game wasn't just about blustering intimidation. This was a coordinated land grab. I drove straight down to the county office, signed in, and got a full copy of the petition. Sure enough, there it was in black and white, my address listed under properties proposed for inclusion. No signatures from homeowners, no consent forms, nothing but a flimsy map with dotted lines and a letter from Gloria requesting expedited review. "Who approved this submission?" I asked the woman behind the glass window. She tapped a few keys. "It was filed electronically on behalf of the HOA board, no signatures attached. It's under initial review but flagged for irregularities." I raised an eyebrow. "Irregularities like what?" She leaned in a little. "There's no evidence of homeowner consent, and the parcels listed include several homes that are already outside of city zoning for HOA inclusion. It's not going anywhere fast. I thanked her, took the packet, and walked out with one hand dialing a contact I hadn't needed in years, my cousin Reggie, municipal attorney for the next county over. I gave him a rundown and emailed him the documents. "Walt, this isn't just sketchy," he said after skimming. "It's flat out unlawful. If they're submitting this with forged or missing consent, they're opening themselves up to civil and possibly criminal liability." "You want me to call the county attorney?" "Not yet," I said. "Let me see where Gloria's headed with this." But I wasn't going to wait around for her next move. That afternoon, I printed out a stack of flyers with a bold headline across the top. "Is Briar Glen HOA trying to take your land?" I listed bullet points with fax parcel numbers, quotes from the county office, and contact information for homeowners to verify whether their land had been included in the annexation attempt. I didn't sign my name, but I didn't need to. By sunset, I delivered the flyers to every mailbox along the eastern boundary. Folks on that stretch had always considered themselves outside of HOA reach. Most of them had bought their homes before Briar Glen even existed. I knew they'd be furious. Around 8 that night, I heard a knock on my door. It was Rick Hanley, a retired Air Force mechanic who lived 2 streets over. He held the flyer in one hand and a beer in the other. "This real?" he asked, voice low. "Every word." "You might want to check with the county yourself." He stepped inside without another word. By the time he left, he'd already called 3 other neighbors. Within 48 hours, we had a dozen homeowners comparing notes, all of them just as blindsided. Turns out, Gloria had included every lot along the eastern edge in her little scheme, all without a single meeting, vote, or signed approval. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday. It was usually a quiet affair in the community center, maybe 6 or 7 regulars, mostly folks bored enough to care about lawn signage and mailbox colors. This time, the room was packed. Folding chairs lined the back wall, and every seat was filled with angry faces. I stood near the side door, arms crossed, while Gloria took her usual seat at the table up front with the rest of the board. She wore a thin-lipped smile, but her eyes flicked nervously around the room. "Before we begin," she said, tapping her gavel like anyone cared, "I'd like to welcome everyone and remind you that disruptive behavior will not be tolerated." Rick stood up before she could say another word. "You gonna explain why you tried to annex my land without telling me?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Gloria blinked, then feigned confusion. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." I raised my hand, holding up the printout from the county office. "This here says you submitted a petition to bring our properties under HOA control. No meetings, no votes, no signatures. You want to tell us how that happened?" One of the board members, a guy named Ted with a mustache like a broom, leaned forward. "Is that true, Gloria?" Gloria pursed her lips. "There was a misunderstanding with the filing. It was meant to be exploratory, a preliminary document." Rick stepped forward. "You filed a legal petition with the county. That's not exploratory. That's fraud." A woman near the back, Dana, who ran a dog grooming business out of her garage, held up her phone. "I just got a call back from the registrar. My property's on the list too. You said we were outside the HOA boundary when we moved in." Gloria's smile was cracking. "It was an administrative error. I assure you, no harm was intended. Reggie had warned me that if she doubled down, I'd need to escalate, so I stepped forward, calm and clear. I've already spoken to the county attorney's office. They're reviewing whether this constitutes filing false documents. If it does, that's a criminal offense under state law, and every homeowner listed has grounds for a civil suit." The room went still. Ted whispered something to the man beside him, who leaned away like he wanted no part of it. "I move to suspend the board president pending a full investigation," Ted said suddenly. Gloria's head snapped toward him. "You can't." "I can," he said. "It's in the bylaws, and if it's not, I'll make the motion anyway and resign if you block it." More voices rose in agreement. Someone called for a vote. Hands shot up. Gloria stood, shouting over the noise that the meeting was out of order, that none of this was official, but no one was listening anymore. She stormed out, knocking over a chair on her way. The gavel she'd brought to keep order clattered to the floor behind her. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me with questions about how to get their own surveys, how to challenge the HOA's authority, whether they could leave entirely. I told them the truth. It takes time, it takes unity, but it's possible. That night, Rick and I sat on my porch with a couple of lawn chairs and a pair of cold drinks. He looked out over the quiet neighborhood and said, "I always thought HOAs were just annoying. Never thought I'd see one try to steal land. They count on people not paying attention," I said. "That's how they get away with it. Not anymore." The next morning, the county placed a formal hold on the annexation petition, citing irregularities under investigation. Reggie confirmed they were opening an inquiry into possible fraud. Gloria didn't show her face for days. When she did, it was to collect a box of files from the HOA office escorted by a sheriff's deputy. The morning after Gloria's dramatic exit, a quiet tension settled over Briar Glen like humidity before a thunderstorm. The community center sat dark, its blinds drawn and bulletin boards still littered with outdated flyers and rules written in that bland, passive-aggressive tone HOAs seem to specialize in. But the power vacuum Gloria left behind didn't last long. That same afternoon, I got a call from Ted, the broom mustache board member who turned on her at the meeting. He asked if I'd be willing to meet him at the town planning office the next day. He said he wanted to clear a few things up, and the way he said it sounded like he'd seen something that rattled him more than a little. I met him at the office just after noon. He was already inside, pacing near the zoning counter with a thin folder clutched in both hands like it might fly away. His face looked different from the night of the meeting, not just worried, but older somehow. Like the last few days had aged him. "She kept us in the dark," he said without waiting for a greeting. "We thought it was just about adding a few houses to the HOA, maybe bringing in more dues. But this goes deeper." He handed me the folder. Inside were photocopies of internal HOA financials. Most of it looked like typical bureaucratic fluff: ledgers, expense reports, maintenance costs. But halfway through, I hit a page labeled Community Improvement Budget Forecast. 2 items stood out. A line for Eastern Perimeter beautification totaling nearly $75,000 and another for legal compliance allocation, listed under discretionary funds. "That's a lot of money for flowers and mulch," I said, flipping the page. He leaned in, voice low. "It's not for landscaping, I checked. That money was rerouted 3 months ago into a private escrow account managed off books, not through the HOA's bank. Through something called Elm Valley Holdings. Never heard of it," I said. "It's a shell. I ran it through a friend who works in real estate finance. It's tied to a developer out of state, someone who specializes in flipping troubled HOA communities into luxury zones." I didn't respond at first. Just stared at the numbers and felt the weight of what I was holding. "She was trying to force an annexation," Ted said, "inflate the dues base and sell the governing rights to a private firm. They would have bulldozed this place into something unrecognizable." "And she didn't tell the board?" I asked. "Not a word. She funneled this through legal subcommittees that don't even exist on our charter." I think she forged the meeting minutes. We took the folder straight to the county district attorney's office. Ted gave his statement while I sat in the waiting area, watching a kid build a tower out of coffee stirrers. When Ted finally came out, his face was pale but set. "They're opening a formal investigation," he said. "Forgery, wire fraud, misappropriation of funds, possibly racketeering, depending on how deep this Elm Valley thing goes." I drove home in silence, windows down, letting the wind swirl through the cab. The neighborhood looked the same: kids on scooters, sprinklers ticking over front lawns, dogs barking through picket fences. But something under the surface had shifted, and it wasn't just Gloria's absence. It was the realization that she'd nearly sold out the entire community for a payout no one had agreed to. That evening, As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Dana from the dog grooming business came by with a thick envelope in her hand. "You're not gonna believe what I found," she said, handing it over. "I used to do billing for a property management firm before I started my own shop. Got curious and went digging through the HOA's public records, and look at this." Inside were copies of payment receipts, monthly transfers labeled as consulting fees paid to a law firm called Haywood and Lane. A quick search showed the firm was defunct, but the address, it matched a P.O. box registered to Gloria's husband. "She was paying herself through a fake law firm," I said, flipping through the receipts. "Over 2 years," Dana added. "Looks like she laundered close to 100,000 that way." By the next morning, the sheriff's office had sealed off the HOA's office with yellow tape. A detective named Alvarez came by my place that afternoon and asked if I'd be willing to hand over the footage of the surveyors on my property. I gave him the original file from my security system. He didn't say much, but his expression said plenty. 2 days later, Gloria was arrested at her sister's house 1 town over. They found 2 shredders still warm, a suitcase of HOA files, and a half-packed duffel with passports and cash. She was booked on charges of fraud, falsification of legal documents, and criminal conspiracy to deprive homeowners of property rights. The county prosecutor held a press conference that evening, and for once, nobody in Briar Glen was complaining about the noise. The fallout was quick and brutal. The remaining HOA board members resigned en masse the following week. A temporary oversight committee was formed, led by volunteers like Dana and Rick, with help from the county's community governance office. They began rebuilding from the ground up, rewriting bylaws, auditing every financial trail, and holding open meetings in the community park with folding chairs and clipboards. One afternoon, I was helping Rick install a new message board near the entrance when he looked over at me and said, "You think we'll ever trust anyone to run this thing again?" I tightened the bolt and shrugged. "Might not have to. Maybe it's not about trusting people to run it. Maybe it's about making sure no one can run off with it." He nodded at that, and we kept working. Weeks passed. The local paper ran a full feature on the scandal, calling it one of the most egregious abuses of HOA power in state history. Ted was interviewed on camera, and even Gloria's attorney had to admit that mistakes were made. She eventually accepted a plea deal in exchange for testifying against the parties behind Elm Valley Holdings. Turns out, she wasn't the only one trying to profit off the annexation scam. But what stuck with me most was what came next. At a town hall 6 weeks after her arrest, the county commissioner proposed something I didn't see coming. A measure to strip HOAs of annexation rights entirely unless approved by a supermajority of current, consenting homeowners. The motion passed unanimously. I didn't speak at that meeting. I didn't have to. The people who'd tried to steal the land under our feet were gone. And the people who lived here, nurses, mechanics, teachers, and small business owners, had taken it back without waiting for anyone to give them permission. Later that evening, I sat on my porch as the cicadas hummed and the streetlights flickered on. The old boundaries were still marked by the weather-worn stakes I'd driven in years ago, but now they meant something more. They weren't just property lines. They were a reminder. A reminder that if someone comes for your home, you don't wait for trouble to knock, you meet it at the door, coffee in one hand and the truth in the other. 3 weeks after Gloria's arrest, the last traces of her regime were being scraped off the community like rust from an old gate. The old Briar Glen HOA sign at the neighborhood entrance, once an emblem of order and overreach, had been taken down. In its place stood a plywood board with hand-painted letters that read, "Community Meeting, Saturday all welcome." It was temporary, but it said everything. Rick and I were helping Dana dig a post hole for a new pet waste station when a county vehicle rolled up. A man in plain clothes stepped out, holding a sealed envelope and a badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as Detective Harland from the Financial Crimes Division. I'm following up on the Elm Valley Holdings trail, he said, scanning the area around us like he wasn't quite sure this was the right place to be asking about a white-collar fraud case. I believe you're Mr. Venn? Yeah, I said, wiping my hands on a rag. What do you need? He handed me the envelope. Subpoena for your security footage archives everything from the last 6 months. We've identified one of the surveyors as a subcontractor tied to a real estate syndicate under investigation for land fraud in 3 states. We're coordinating with federal investigators now. Rick let out a low whistle. I led Harland into the house and pulled up the footage archive on a portable drive I'd kept offline for security. As I copied the files, he paced my living room, pausing at a framed photograph of my dad and me standing next to a busted tractor. Your father serve? He asked. Korea, I said. Mechanic. Taught me everything I know about standing your ground. Harlan nodded, tucking the drive into his case. Good man, sounds like. As he left, I asked, is she talking? Gloria, he paused at the threshold. She's cooperating. Turns out she wasn't the top of the food chain, just the local teeth, but her testimony's helping us map the hierarchy. You'll probably see some indictments in the next few weeks. He tipped his head and drove off. The next morning, I got a call from the assistant district attorney, a sharp-voiced woman named Callahan. She asked if I'd be willing to testify in a closed-door deposition about the boundary survey incident and the annexation petition. I agreed and drove down that afternoon. The deposition was held in a nondescript office building with gray carpet and flickering recessed lights. Callahan asked questions with surgical precision: dates, names, who entered my property, what they said, how they acted. When I told her about the fake law firm payments, she scribbled something down and handed it off to a clerk. You understand, she said, this goes beyond HOA malfeasance. We're dealing with fraudulent land acquisition, mail fraud, and possibly even racketeering under the RICO Act. Your footage and testimony are foundational. What's the end goal here? I asked her. To make sure this never happens again, not here, not in any neighborhood in the state. We're working on legislation to force stricter oversight of HOA financials and eliminate unilateral boundary expansion. Your case is the catalyst. I walked out of that office feeling something I hadn't in weeks. Closure, or at least the kind that comes from knowing the right people were finally paying attention. Back in Briar Glen, the neighborhood was undergoing a slow transformation, not just physically, but culturally. Without the old board, things got quieter, more cooperative. People started cutting their own deals. One neighbor traded lawn maintenance for help fixing his fence. Another offered weekend tutoring in exchange for house sitting. There were no citations, no violation letters, just people getting along for the first time in years. At the next open meeting in the park, Rick stood up and proposed something unexpected, dissolving the HOA altogether. We've seen what happens when a few people get too much control, he said. We don't need oversight, we need community. There were murmurs, but no objections. Dana passed around a petition, and by the end of the afternoon, over 80% of the homeowners had signed. I watched from the bench under the oak tree, arms folded, letting the breeze carry the weight of what we'd been through. When Dana handed me the clipboard, I hesitated for half a second, then added my name to the list. The following week, the county approved the dissolution request. Briar Glen was no longer governed by an HOA. Not long after, I got another call from Detective Harland. He said 2 federal indictments had been issued against executives tied to Elm Valley Holdings. Gloria's testimony had led them to bank accounts in Delaware and a shell company in Nevada. She'd taken a plea deal in exchange for a reduced sentence, but she'd also forfeited all assets connected to the scheme, including the consulting payments she funneled through the fake law firm. Turns out, Harland said, she was promised a kickback once the annexation went through, about $200,000, all of it's being seized. What about restitution? I asked. Victim compensation funds being set up. You'll probably be contacted as part of the initial disbursement. I wasn't interested in the money. I told him to send mine to the community park fund. The last time I saw Gloria was in a courtroom downtown. I'd been called to give a victim impact statement, and she sat at the defendant's table in a pale gray blazer, her hair pulled back tight. She didn't look up once, not when I entered, not while I spoke. I bought my home to build something stable, I told the court. She tried to steal that for personal gain, not just from me but from everyone around me. I'm not here for revenge, I'm here to make sure it ends with her. The judge sentenced her to 18 months with parole eligibility after 12. Light, maybe. But considering she'd flipped on a multi-million-dollar fraud ring, it was the best the DA could get. As I walked out of the courthouse, I passed a news crew setting up on the sidewalk. One of the reporters recognized me and asked if I had a statement. Yeah, I said. Don't let your guard down just because someone wears a blazer and calls it a community. I didn't wait for follow-up questions. Spring came early that year. The cherry blossoms bloomed along the east side, and for the first time in a long while, the only thing landing in mailboxes were birthday invitations and Girl Scout cookie forms. The old HOA office was converted into a shared tool library, managed by volunteers. Kids painted the walls with murals of trees, dogs, and a huge smiling sun. Someone even added a chalkboard for neighborhood notes. One afternoon, I was repairing my rain barrel when a young couple walked up the driveway. They said they were looking at houses nearby and had heard the neighborhood was different. We're not looking for a gated community, the woman said. Just somewhere people aren't afraid of their own neighbors. I laughed and told them the whole story, everything, from the surveyor incident to the courtroom. By the end, the guy shook his head and said, "So, you're like the reason this place still exists." Nah, I said. I just kicked out the termites. Everyone else rebuilt the house. They ended up buying a home 2 doors down. Good folks. They planted a row of sunflowers along the fence, and every morning their little girl walks by my place and waves like it's a ritual. I still have the original county plat map framed above my workbench. Not because I need proof anymore, but because it reminds me what nearly happened and what didn't. The land didn't change, but the people did, and that's what turned the tide. Not one man shouting into the void, but a dozen voices rising in unison. One neighbor setting down their rake to help another. One homeowner refusing to be intimidated. One community saying enough. We didn't just stand up to the HOA, we dismantled it, and we built something better in its place.